Exposed to the time vortex, Rose Tyler, now in the form of the Bad Wolf, says that she can see everything. All that is, all that was, all that ever could be. There's been a great many could-bes in Doctor Who's past 5 decades, and the road from 1963 to 2022 is littered with half-finished scripts and rejected pitches. So with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with Who Culture, here with 10 unmade Doctor Who stories we wish we'd seen. Number 10. Rose was actually created by the Doctor. Russell T Davies' first series of Doctor Who nearly featured a script written by another lauded British screenwriter. Davies approached his friend Paul Abbott to write an episode for the series, and the pair had previously worked together on Abbott's BBC series Linda Green, which also featured Christopher Eccleston. Abbott's episode would have explored the idea that Rose was an experiment by the Doctor to create his perfect companion. The idea was never developed much further than that due to Abbott's commitments with the increasingly popular Shameless. And it's not clear in the small amount of information given by RTD how exactly the Doctor bred Rose for this purpose. Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimely engineered Pete and Jackie's courtship, perhaps? It is strange to think how different the tone of the show would have been if the Doctor had been revealed to be a manipulative geneticist. And the Doctor has manipulated companions before, of course, but it does seem at odds with the lighter, more accessible tone of the 2005 reboot. Number 9. Killer Cats of Gallifrey. In a follow-up to The Deadly Assassin, the Doctor Who production team wanted to return to Gallifrey for the following season. Now that story ended up being The Invasion of Time, but the original pitch for the season 15 finale was quite different. Killers of the Dark would have revealed that the planet of the Time Lords was also home to a race of cat people whose culture was similar to those of Asian countries. Not much is known about the story other than it was to feature a gladiator-style battle in front of a stadium full of cat people. Perhaps this would have written out Leela the way Louise Jameson had always wanted, sacrificing her life in battle for the Doctor. David Weir's script got as far as the costume stage, with designer Dee Robson submitting some design sketches. In the end, script editor Anthony Reid and director Gerald Blake decided it would be far too difficult to achieve on Doctor Who's already tight budget. Instead, they opted to make Invasion of Time, which introduced us to the Outsiders instead, Gallifrey's cheaper to realise humanoid population who had turned their backs on Time Lord society. Number 8. Jamie's happy ending. The ending of the War Games was heartbreaking. Sent back to their appropriate time and place, Jamie and Zoe are wiped of their memories of their many adventures with the Doctor. Not so bad for Zoe, who returns to a fairly comfortable life on a space station, but Jamie faces a much harder life. Returned back to his life following the Battle of Culloden, he faces slavery, murder, or as detailed in one comic by the legendary Grant Morrison, madness. His ending, however, was almost much more hopeful. In a story that would have formed the third part in a Yeti trilogy, he and the TARDIS would arrive at a Scottish castle owned by an aging laird. The castle is soon under siege from the Great Intelligence and the Yeti. The Doctor defeats them and Jamie decides to stay on at the castle, becoming its new laird. He falls in love with a local girl, Fiona, and is left to live happily ever after. The story was never filmed due to an ongoing copyright dispute between the BBC and the writers Melvin Haseman and Henry Lincoln, who eventually withdrew their script. And so Jamie was left to his fate on the fields of Culloden. Number 7. Matt Berry as the Meddlesome Monk. Peter Harness, who co-wrote the dark urban thriller The Zygon Inversion/Invasion with Stephen Moffat, pitched another story that was much lighter. The story was to feature the return of a renegade Time Lord last seen in the 1960s, the Monk. Originally played by comedy actor Peter Butterworth, Harness envisioned Matt Berry in the role. The plot was to feature the meddlesome Time Lord calling on the 12th Doctor for help after he accidentally averts the Russian Revolution by playing Boney M to Rasputin. They then try to put history back on course, with the monk eventually taking on the identity of Rasputin. It's a mad comic idea, but it might just have worked, and one can only imagine what a brilliant comedy double act Capaldi and Berry would have made. Moffat turned down the pitch, and Harness's next story for the series was the underwhelming Pyramid at the End of the World. Watching a blind doctor trying to crack an entry code is nowhere near as much fun as him mucking around with Rasputin, Matt Berry and the music of Boney M. Number 6, The Final Game. Introduced to the series as Moriarty to the Third Doctor's Sherlock Holmes, the Master was intended to be written out towards the end of the Pertwee era, with a storyline conceived where the former friends would do battle one last time, and during that confrontation, it was to be revealed that the Master was either the Doctor's brother or a personification of his dark side. The climactic scenes were to see the Master sacrifice himself to save the Doctor, his former friend. Whilst it was never produced, the story has been hugely influential over the years. The idea of the Master's conscience catching up with them would be a key part of Stephen Moffat's final series as showrunner. Not only that, but the idea of the Master sacrificing their life to save the Doctor was echoed in the climax to The End of Time Part 2, when he forces the Time Lords back to hell. The story was never produced due to the tragic and untimely death of actor Roger Delgado, and his loss heavily impacted Pertwee, who decided to leave the show, along with script editor Terence Dix and producer Barry Letts. Number 5, Return of the Autons. If Doctor Who hadn't been put on hiatus after its 22nd season, there was a whole host of adventures planned. Many of these, like The Nightmare Fair and Mission to Magnus, have since been both novelised and dramatised in the intervening years. One unmade story that remains so due to the lack of a finished script was Robert Holmes's Yellow Fever and How to Cure It. In a classic example of producer John Nathan Turner's grab bag approach to story commissioning, it was to be set in Singapore and feature the return of the Master, the Rani, and for the first time in over 20 years, the Autons. Also appearing would be the Brigadier, who would be in Singapore on holiday before being dragged into the adventure. All that's really known about the story is that the Master and the Rani would be disguised as street theatre performers. Now, John Nathan Turner did do a location scout, or a holiday as some might call it, but beyond this not much more was planned. It does sound like a little bit of an overstuffed combination of elements, but if anyone could make it work, it's Robert Holmes. Number 4, Nazis in the British Museum. Mark Gatiss has written for nearly every series of Doctor Who from 2005 to 2017, with a few gaps here and there. And one of those gaps is in Series 4, when his script entitled The Suicide Exhibition was dropped in favour of The Fires of Pompeii. It was held over for a potential special in the following series, but it was ultimately not made. Set in the British Museum at the height of the Blitz, it was an Indiana Jones-style adventure that pitted the Doctor and Donna against a team of Nazis trying to release something. The museum is revealed to be a giant puzzle box, and the Doctor and Donna have to deal with trapdoors, booby traps, and various other nasties in order to stop the Nazis achieving their goal. While this particular story went unmade, he was able to visit another London tourist attraction when he set Victory of the Daleks in Churchill's War Rooms. Number 3, the live Halloween episode. Another 4th series story that was eventually abandoned by the production team was Century House, written by Tom McRae. The writer had previously written the Cyberman 2-parter for the 2nd series and was this time given a very different concept by Russell T Davies. Designed to function as the companion light episode, it would focus mostly on the Doctor, taking part in an episode of Most Haunted. Donna would be watching the live broadcast from home as the Doctor and a group of TV ghost hunters investigate the haunting of the Red Widow. Davies liked the script, but he worried that following The Unicorn and the Wasp there would be too much comedy. He also felt that he'd given the writer a poor premise and no longer had faith in the concept. The story was eventually shelved and replaced by the RTD-penned Midnight, a far scarier episode than Century House would have been. It was a fun concept, but it's unlikely we'll ever get to see it, given that TV ghost hunting isn't as popular as it used to be. Number 2, Stephen Fry's King Arthur story. How exciting was the lead up to Doctor Who's 2nd series? Not only had the return of the Cybermen, Sarah Jane Smith and K9 been revealed, but fans were also promised an episode written by Stephen Fry. Now, the polymath author had got quite far in the writing process. He's attended the first read-through, he went for dinner with his fellow Doctor Who writers. His episode was set in the 1920s and would feature a sci-fi spin on Arthurian legend. More specifically, the Green Knight, recently immortalised on film by Dev Patel. Fry's episode was to reveal that Gawain had survived his beheading because he was actually of alien origin. The finished draft was deemed too expensive to realise in its original form and rewrites were suggested. Sadly, a multi-talented figure like Stephen Fry is constantly in demand, and so he couldn't commit to the rewrites. The story was sadly abandoned, and despite suggestion that it might have been revisited in the following series, it again never surfaced. What's even more upsetting is that the story that replaced it was the critically derided Fear Her. Sentient crayon drawings are cheaper to realise than Arthurian legends, but much less exciting. Number 1. Tom Baker's Doctor Who movie. One of the great what-if moments in Doctor Who history is Tom Baker and Ian Marter's proposed movie in the mid to late 1970s. Now, they had a director attached, but they could never raise the funding required to make it a reality. Had it been made, it would have been an incredibly memorable combination of folk horror and psychedelic sci-fi. Doctor Who meets Scratchman was to pit the Doctor, Harry and Sarah against scarecrows in a Scottish village and the devil himself, climaxing in a giant game of pinball featuring the Daleks. It's quintessentially Tom Baker. Utterly mad but very charming. Whilst the film never saw the light of day, BBC Books did eventually commission Tom Baker to adapt his and Marter's original treatment into a novel. It's both a creepy, blackly comedic Doctor Who adventure and a touching tribute to the Baker era. And that concludes our list. If you can think of any that we missed, then do let us know in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also, head over to Twitter and follow us there at Who Culture, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with Who Culture, and in the words of River Song herself, goodbye, sweeties.